In this example, I want to go through a table view controller where we implement a master details type relationship. And the idea there is that we'll have an initial table view controller within our Xcode project that shows some of the information about a record, and then we'll be able to dive into that individual record and show additional details about that record. Okay, so I want to start with a new Xcode project. And we're just going to create an app. The app will be master details, storyboard application. I'm just going to save it on my desktop. And I want to do some pre-work here. So the storyboard I'm not going to need. The initial view controller that's there, so that's going to go away. So that's cleaned up. And I'm going to go ahead and organize this. So I'm going to have a new group called views where my storyboard goes in there. And then I will have another new group, which will be my models. And I am going to have to spell that correctly. Okay, and the idea with my models is that's where my model class will go. I'm not going to need this viewcontroller.swift file. We're not going to use it. So I'm going to move that to the trash. And let's go ahead and start implementing some of this code. So the first thing I want to do is I want to create a Swift class in the models. So I'm going to say I want a new file, and it's going to be a Swift file. And the file that I'm going to use is I'm going to use a sports player, so a player.swift file. And the idea with my player class would be that my player class will have some instance variables. So in this example, let's go ahead and set it up so that the player is going to have a name and a team and a number. Okay, so this is going to be my player. I'm going to have the player implement the custom string convertible protocol. And then because of that, then this player is going to need a description. And the idea is with that description, all I want to do is I want to return the values of name, team, and number. So I'm going to go ahead and return this custom string convertible. So name is going to be self.name. And then I'm going to use a new line here. So it's all one big string, but I'm just using a new line character. So name, team, and another new line, and then lastly, number. So I'll put the number character there as well. And that's going to be the return value. And then it's going to complain about the fact that there's no initializers. So I'll go ahead and add that initializer. So my initializer is going to take in the name, team, and number. So I'll take in the name as a string, the team as a string, and the number as an int. And I'll assign self.name that incoming parameter and self.team that incoming parameter. And then lastly, self.number that incoming parameter. Okay, and this is going to be our player class. So pretty straightforward. Throw 3 instance variables, an initializer, and then a description that implements or fulfills that custom string convertible protocol. Also within models, I want to create a new file. It's going to be a Swift file. It's going to be our player manager. So player manager. And this player manager class will then have a method to get all of the players. So a function, get all players, that does not take any parameters and returns an array of player objects. So we're going to return, let's start with a variable called players. That's going to be an array of player objects equal to an empty array to start with. And then we will populate players. We'll append player. And then we're going to pick information about that player. So the name, so we'll go with Aaron Rodgers for the Packers. and he's going to be number 12. And then we will add another players. We're going to add another player, and the name will be Mike Trout. He plays for the LA Angels, and he's number 27. And then we'll do one more player, name being Derek Jeter. He plays for the New York Yankees, and he's number 2. And that's what we're going to return as players. And because I'm not going to have any instance variables within the player manager class, I'm going to make this a static function, which is just going to make it easier to use. So I'll be able to call player manager.getAllPlayers, and that will return all of my players. Okay, so this is my model class. So I have 2 model classes. One is basically a manager that's going to create an array and return that array of our player objects. Our player objects are fairly straightforward. It's a class that has 3 different attributes and then a description method. Okay, and at this point I want to go back to our storyboard, and I want to implement a table view controller to display our players. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and add a navigation controller. And a navigation controller automatically brings with it, so you'll see when I'm dragging that onto the scene, it's bringing on 2 different views. The first view is the navigation controller itself, and then it brings with it a table view controller. So that automatically comes as a pair. So this table view controller, what I want to do is I want to take that table view controller and I want to wire it up to a class definition that we're going to create. And the idea is that this table view controller would then render out all of our corresponding players. So in order to do that, I'm going to go ahead and add a new group. It's going to be our controllers. And I'm going to add a table view controller to the project. Okay, so it's going to be a Cocoa Touch class, and it's going to derive from table view controller. This is going to be our players table view controller, and I'm going to save it in that controllers group. Okay, and we already know that some of the information is going to come with just right out of the box because we derived from UITableViewController, and UITableViewController is going to be required to implement this table view data source in order to render out player information. Okay, so the way I want to handle this is this controller class is going to have a collection of players. So here's our players. It's going to be an array of player objects, and by default it's equal to an empty array. And the way we're going to load those players is in the viewDidLoad, we're going to say self.players is equal to our player manager class.getAllPlayers. Okay, so that we have a collection of players. And we hard-coded some player data in here, so we're getting those 3 players. That's what's going to show up in our table view controller. Okay, and then the way we want to handle this is we have to implement our table view data source methods to implement that protocol. So the number of sections that we want is 1. The number of rows in a section, we're going to say we want to go to our players, and we want to know how many players there actually are. And then lastly, what we need to do is we need to actually customize our cell a little bit so that we can actually render a cell. So this is the method that we want, is cell for row at index path. One thing that we want to do though is when we grab a cell from our table view, we want to have an identifier for that cell so that we can reuse it as we're scrolling if there's multiple rows. So we're going to go to our storyboard and we're going to give this table view cell an identifier. Okay, and we're going to call that our player cell. The style right now, what I want to do is I want to make it a subtitle cell. And the subtitle cell is a little bit different than what we've used in the past, but that's okay. I just want to customize it so that it's a subtitle cell. And the idea there is that you really have 2 labels. You have the title and then the subtitle for each cell. We're just playing around with the view, but we don't necessarily have to do that. We could just make it a regular cell if we wanted to. Basic, right detail, left detail, subtitle. We could also implement a custom UI table view cell if we wanted to, but for this example, let's just go ahead and make it a subtitle cell. And then now that we have that player cell as our identifier, we can go back to the controller and we can say that the cell that we want, so this reuse identifier, is going to be player cell. Okay, then we have to configure the cell a little bit. So the way we want to handle that is we want to set the cell text label .text equal to a specific player's. Let's use the player name as kind of the main label. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into our players at a specific index, and the way we're going to get the index is we're going to go to the index path and go to the row, and then we're going to grab the player's name. We can do the same thing for the detail text label. So we're going to set the text equal to self.players, again index path .row .team. And then we'll return the cell. That's all we really need to do at this point. So let's go ahead and run this and make sure that when we do run it, we can actually see the players that we expect. So I changed our simulator so that it's running against an iPhone 11, so we're going to go ahead and run it. This is just basically a basic table view controller, and as I'm starting this up and launching it, it's starting up the simulator. And as it's starting up the simulator, I remember that I forgot one thing, which is we have this player's table view controller right now, and it's wired up so that we want to describe how it's a table view data source to render our players. But we never wired up this class definition to the actual storyboard. So we're going to run into problems there. So I'm going over to the storyboard, and you'll see that we're not going to end up actually rendering out any players once the simulator starts up. And the reason why not is because this table view controller right now is not wired up to our class definition, which is that player's table view controller. And then the other thing that I had forgot to do in the storyboard is this navigation controller. If I go to the attributes, I did not mark it as the initial view controller. So the one that was on the storyboard when the project initially started up was the initial view controller, and you'll notice that the scene failed. It said there was no main entry point because there was no initial view controller. The initial view controller is going to be my navigation controller. Okay, so now that's changed and our simulator started up, we can stop this and try again. And you'll see that we're getting our player and the corresponding team for each of the different records that we have. Okay, so life's good there. Okay, I want to fix this so that it doesn't say root view controller. I want to show this as my player list, so I'm going to change the title to player list. Okay, so that's fairly straightforward. That's an easy fix. But what I want to also show is that if we're looking at all of our players, I should be able to click on an individual player. So whether I'm talking about Aaron Rodgers or Mike Trout or Derek Jeter, I should be able to go into a secondary screen to get additional detail about that. So I'm thinking of like my contact list in an iPhone application. I have a list of contacts. If I click on one of the contacts, it takes me to a secondary screen that gives me additional information like what's this person's phone number and email and home address and work address and stuff like that. Same thing with my player list, and right now the only additional detail that I'd have is a number, but certainly I might have height, weight, salary, stuff like that, maybe career statistics and stuff like that. So for this fictitious example though, I want to be able to select an individual cell and go to a secondary screen. There's a couple of things that I have to do with regard to that. Ideally, I want to let the user know graphically that there is something additional that they can do in this cell. So right now I'm highlighting the player cell. I can either do this through Interface Builder, so I'm in the storyboard and I can set this, or I could do it in code as well. I'll show you both ways. So with this player cell, there's this accessory, and what I want to do with the accessory is I want to indicate that there is additional information that's important about this cell. So typically there will be this disclosure indicator, and you'll see what happens is it puts up this little arrow to indicate there's some additional information. If I say the default is none, another way I could have done that is through code. When I'm getting a cell right here, this cell.accessory type equal to, and then it's an enumerated type, so I can say that I want it to be a disclosure indicator. Okay, so now when we run this, it's going to look to the end user like there is additional information, right? So it looks like I should be able to click on any of these 3 player records, and I should be going to a follow-up screen, and you're noticing that nothing is obviously happening, okay? So I want to take that next step. So as they select one of these records, I want to go to a detail screen to show all of the detailed information about an individual player. So there's a couple of things that have to happen here. So an event is occurring, they're selecting a record, which should cause me to transition to a new screen. And then within that new screen, I need basically for that handoff to happen. So from my player list, I'm saying if I click here, I want additional information about Derek Jeter. Or if I click here, I want additional information about Mike Trout. So I have to do that handoff of player information from my player list to my details view. Okay, so that's what we want to wire up next. Within our table view controller, there's a method which is didSelectRow@IndexPath. Okay, so I'm just going to do a quick search, did select row, and I'm not seeing it in here. I think it should automatically come. Editing style. Apparently it's not there. So the way I'm going to handle it is I'm just going to type in did select row@IndexPath. Okay, and that function will come along. And what I want to do here is essentially the user's selecting a row. I want to identify the row that they selected because that's going to be important. And then I want to perform a segue. Okay, so I want to transition to another screen. So first thing I have to do though is this code is going to be important here. So line 49 is going to be important, but I'm going to go up to the top of my controller class and I'm going to say that there's going to be an additional variable called selected player. And the selected player here in this case is going to be a player, but by default there is none selected, so I'm going to initialize it to nil. I'm making it an optional. You don't have to select a player. And I'm going to initialize it to nil so I don't have to have an initializer with my table view controller. And then where this would get set is when the user actually clicks on one of the rows. So did select row at an index path. So what I want to do is I want to say self.selectedPlayer is equal to a specific player, so self.players. And the way I'm going to identify which player is I'm going to use that index path variable to use that to determine which player. Okay, so that's going to give me a selected player. And at that point, then I should transition using a segue. If I can type. Okay, so I transition using a segue. Okay, so let's go back over to our storyboard. And what I want to do is I want to create a segue to a new screen that's going to display details about a player. I'm going to use another table view controller. And again, I'm not just going to drop a table view controller on here. I'm going to drop a navigation controller on. Okay, so we're going to hit that navigation controller. And if we're looking at this now, there's 4 different screens, right? The first navigation controller, which brings us to the player list. The second navigation controller, which is going to bring us to a player's detail view. And it's a table view right now. So this second table view that we're actually looking at is going to be treated quite a bit different. And the reason I say that is because the way I want to set this up is I want to set it up so that it's displaying one player record, which makes it a little bit interesting. So right now it's showing this root view controller. I don't know that I want it to show root view controller. I want to show the player details. Okay, and I want it tied to a specific controller. So I'm going to go ahead and add a new controller. It's going to be a Cocoa Touch class called Player Details Table View Controller. Okay, and it doesn't necessarily intuitively make sense that this is going to be a table view, but I want to create a different type of table view here. I want the controller itself. And why am I not getting what I want? It's root view controller. Size is inferred. I want to wire that to my player details table view controller. That should be fine. And then it's still not giving me what I want. And what I'm looking for there is I want to change this table view controller a little bit. Why am I not seeing that? Okay, what I'm looking for is the sections, and I wasn't looking at the table view for my player details, so the table view is going to have what I'm looking for. Right now the content is dynamic prototypes. What I want to do is I'm going to change that to static cells because I'm no longer rendering out kind of a list of players. I'm trying to render out details about an individual player. So I'm going to change that to static cells, and you'll see the view kind of changes there. So I want to have 3 sections, and the way I'm using this is each section will represent one field. So I'll have a section for the player's name, for the player's team, and then for the player's number. So 3 sections. So section 1, 2, 3. And then within the section, I can get into how many cells are going to be there. So you'll notice that the section itself has a section heading. So I'm going to use that as kind of my label. So this first section, section 1, is going to have a header of name. And then I only want 1 cell. So you'll see how it says that there's 3 rows. I want to decrease that to 1 row. So you'll see how I have name, which is the heading, and then 1 row in that section. I want to do the same thing for section 2. So section 2 will be the team, and I only want 1 row. And then section 3, I want to have the number, and again, only 1 row. And this is kind of what I want my user interface to look like, and I don't know why I'm not seeing that cell. That looks right to me. It's interesting that the number cell looks wrong. So my table view has 3 sections. I want to make it 4 sections just to see if I can fix that number. And then I have a table view cell and content inside of it. It's interesting that it's showing up a little bit different. I think we're okay though. The table view cell, what I want to do is I want to make it so that there's 3 sections. Okay. Let's start there. I just want to render this table view controller. So what's going to happen is when this table view cell is selected, I want to then segue from my player list to this navigation controller, which is ultimately going to take me to the player details. So I'm going to create that segue. The way I'm going to create the segue is I want to take this player list and I want to segue over to the navigation controller, and I want to present that modally, okay, because it's a details view. Okay, and that's going to create this segue. And I want to go ahead and name this segue. So I want to name this segue. I'm going to give this segue an identifier. Let's call it player selected segue. Okay, and if we go ahead and run this right now, nothing's going to happen because I triggered that segue. I basically said there's a segue from the player list over to this navigation controller, which is ultimately going to show the player details, but it doesn't get triggered as a result of an event. I want to manually call that. So if I go back to my player's table view controller, I've selected a player, and now I want to perform a segue with identifier. And the segue that I want, I've already named it. So if we go back over to my storyboard, I just named that segue. So I'm looking at this segue right here, and it's the player selected segue. So I'm just copying that and pasting it here. So the identifier that I want is this player selected segue. And then the sender, it really doesn't matter. Basically the sender is meant to be the control that triggered that segue. In this case, it really doesn't matter what control triggered that segue, so I'm just going to say that the sender is nil. Okay, and if we go ahead and run this now, eventually we get our player list, and if I click on one of the players, you'll notice that we get this player details screen. Okay, and the player's details screen is not very interesting, and I can just kind of drag it off the screen. We're not getting any information about the individual players. We're not even getting our section headings. Okay, and the reason why we're not getting our section headings is because in our storyboard we said that our player details table view is going to have 3 sections. And then it's going to have, within each section, it's going to have 1 row. All right, so we have the name, the team, and the number. But we linked this player details table view controller to our class definition right here. And our class definition, if we go look, our class definition is a UITableViewController, and in there we had some default code because our class definition is a table view data source, so we're saying the number of sections. What we want to do is, I can delete this. That's kind of interesting. I'm going to delete that. And then number of rows in section, I'm going to delete that as well. And I still need that functionality, but the values can't be 0. So what I want to do is, at the top of the class, instead of having essentially a getter to get those values, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say table view sections is equal to 1. And then I'm going to say table view rows in section equal to 3. So there's 1 section, and then there's 3 rows within that section. And I think that's all I have to do here. And now you'll notice that I'm getting the corresponding records that I was expecting. Okay, so I'm getting the name, the team, the number. So I'm getting those headings. We're not getting any of the player details yet, but that's kind of to come. How do I hand off those player details? So if I select Aaron Rodgers, I expect to see Aaron Rodgers here. If I select Mike Trout, I expect to see Mike Trout here. Okay, so let's go ahead and implement that functionality. Okay, so first thing I have to do is in my player details table view controller, I need a new variable called the player, which is going to be a player instance that's optional, and I'm going to initialize it to nil by default. Okay, so the idea is that I'm going to be displaying a player, and I have to set up this instance variable that's actually going to store that player. Okay, that's going to be important. I have to be able to hand it off from my initial table view controller to the details table view controller. Okay, the way I'm going to do that is when I select that record in my players table view controller, so we have that did select row at index path, we're going to perform a segue. So we're segueing over to the details table view controller, but before we do that, we want to say basically the destination, our player details table view controller, we want to set up that instance variable so that the player is equal to whatever player the user selected. Okay, and the way we're going to do that is we're going to segue, but before we do segue, we're going to have a method that we can actually execute some code, and that method that we can use to execute some code is the prepare for segue. Okay, so before we actually do the segue, we need to do some code. We need to basically say the destination really needs a reference to the selected player. Okay, so the way we're going to handle this is we're going to say that we want to use the segue.destination, and we're saying that the segue destination is really this player details table view controller. So we're going to say we want a variable called let player details tvc, which is going to be a player details table view controller, is going to be equal to this destination. Okay, and then the way we do that is this destination is not by default. It's just by default it's a view controller. We want to say that it's as a player details table view controller. We want to cast it as such. Okay, and if we do that, we should be able to take the player's details table view controller, and then you'll notice that we have the player, and we can assign it to self.selectedPlayer. So we select the player, and we set the selected player on the main table view controller. So we set the selected player. We perform the segue, and when we perform the segue, we figure out what the destination is going to be, which is our player's details table view controller, and we're basically handing off the currently selected player to the destination. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this and see if it's working. And I guess before we run it, I want to do one thing to verify that it's working, is we're setting the player on the destination, this player details table view controller. So what we really want to do is if we go over to the player details table view controller, after the view did load, we should be able to say this view is going to have the player, and we know that it's going to exist. So I can do something like if let player equal to self.player, so that we're in a non-optional state. Then player dot, let's just print the player. Okay, and that'll call the player's description. Okay, so when our player details table view controller view did load method occurs, we're going to print out our existing player that we've handed off from the main table view controller over to the details view controller. Okay, so I select Mike Trout. And you'll notice that I don't have Mike Trout down in my output. What I have is an error, could not cast value of type UI navigation controller to player details table view controller. And it takes a while for you to realize what's going on there, but if I go back over to my player's table view controller, what it's saying is that the segue destination is not a player details table view controller. So when I try to cast this on line 57 to say, hey, the segue's destination is a player's details table view controller, that's not true. What my destination is a UI navigation controller. Okay, and if you remember my storyboard, the way I set it up, we have a navigation controller in front of our table view controller. Okay, so that's where we're running into problems. So if I go to my player's table view controller, really we got to do kind of an intermediate step here. So we're going to have a variable called nav controller. So we're going to have a variable called nav controller, which is a UI navigation controller. And that's going to be equal to our segue destination. And again, our segue destination is just a generic controller, so I'm going to cast that as a UI navigation controller. Okay, that's our segue destination. Okay, then it's complaining, the warning that I'm getting is saying, hey, you're never using this nav controller variable. Are you sure you don't want to just make it an underscore? So like that's the message that I'm going to get here. I don't want to fix that. What I do want to do, though, is instead of saying the segue's destination, I want to go to the nav controller, and then there's a top view controller, and that top view controller is going to be a player details table view controller. Okay, so we have that intermediate step of we can't go directly to our player details table view controller. We have to go to the UI navigation controller first. Okay, so now if we run this, I think we should be working. Okay, so I select Mike Trout, and you'll notice that I'm getting the description for Mike Trout. If I go back over to my simulator, and I select Aaron Rodgers, you'll notice I get the details for Aaron Rodgers. Again, back to the simulator, select Derek Jeter, and I'm getting the details for Derek Jeter. Okay, so that's kind of working. So we have the player in our player details table view controller, so the player is getting populated, but what we want to do is we actually want to render that data. Okay, so I'm going to go back to my storyboard, and I'm going into the player details, and what I want to do is I want to, in this table view cell, what I want to do is I want to set up text fields for it. So here's this text field, and I want a text field that's actually going to render out the name. Okay, so there's the text field for the name. And then I want to do the same thing for the team, so another text field. Okay, and I'm not really worried about where it's positioned as long as it's nested inside the content view, that's fine. And then same thing for the number. So I'll use a text field here. And for some reason, that's been off the whole time, where I have this table view cell and I have this content view, but I can't actually put any content there. So I want this text field inside this content view. And there it goes. I don't know why it's showing up the way it is, but it looks to be okay to me. I want to be able to populate those text fields with text. So in order to do that, I'm going to need to set up an outlet to each of those different fields. So in order to do that, I'm going to go ahead and bring up the assistant editor. And the assistant editor that I want, that is not what I wanted. So interesting that I'm not seeing the assistant editor. There we go. The assistant editor that I want is the player details table view controller. why it's not showing that player details table view controller when I bring up the assistant editor. Let me hide this scene. And then I should be able to click on this, and there's no assistant results. I wonder why I'm not getting assistant results. I think Swift is, in Xcode is not necessarily running its smoothest right now. So what I want to do is I just want to go ahead and close Xcode for a second. And I'll reopen this project. So on my desktop, there's this master details project, and I'm going to go ahead and reopen it. See if we can get it to behave a little bit better. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and hide that. Actually, I don't want to hide that, I guess. I want the storyboard. And then I want to select my view controller. And then I want to see the assistant editor. And I think we're in the player details table view controller. Doesn't look like it. It's the players table view controller. I want the player details. Okay, so I was able to go up into the top and choose the file that I want. And I want to set up an outlet to these text boxes. Okay, so the first one I'm just control dragging in. So this is going to be my name text field. Then I want to do the same thing for the team text field. And then lastly, I want to do the same thing for the number, and I'm running into problems seeing the number, so I want to go into that table view cell, into that text field, and I want to set up an outlet there for the number text field. Okay, so I have those outlets that are set up, and I can close my assistant editor now. And what I want to do is, in those outlets, I want to populate those values. So I want to populate the values for the number, the name, and the team, and I'm going to do that in the view did load. Instead of printing the player, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say self.name text field dot text is equal to player dot name, and self.team text field dot text is equal to player dot team, and self dot number text field is equal to player dot number. And it's complaining that number is an integer, and it's not allowing me to convert that to a string. So the easy way to fix that is I'm going to use that backslash parens and just put that value in a string. And then it should run just fine. So I'm going to go ahead and run this. And the idea here is that we should now have our player list. So we have 3 players, so we have a player list. We can choose from any of those 3 players. So if I choose Derek Jeter, it brings up my user interface, and you can see the numbers kind of out of whack. The layout's not necessarily great, but we have Derek Jeter, we have the Yankees, we have 2. If I pick Mike Trout, we have Mike Trout, the Angels, and 27. And then Aaron Rodgers, we have Aaron Rodgers, Packers, and 12. I want to fix this layout a little bit. And the way I'm going to fix the layout is with constraints. So I'm taking the name text field, and I'm coming down to the constraints down at the bottom here. I'm going to use this toolbar, and I'm going to say that I want to add some constraints. So I'm going to add, I'm just going to do 4 at the top. I'm going to do standard on the left. I want to do standard on the right. So standard I think is 10 and 10 and then 4. I'm going to add those 4 constraints. Okay, so you can see how it takes up most of the space. Same thing with team. I want to do 4, 10, 10, 4. And then lastly, I'll do that with the number text field. So I'll add those constraints, and you can see the constraints are kind of out of whack right now. So 4, 10, 10, 4, and now it should lay out okay. And I'm still not sure why the number is laying out the way it does, but I think it should visually look okay. So if I go to Aaron Rodgers, you can see Aaron Rodgers is looking good. Mike Trout should look good. Derek Jeter should look good. Okay, it'd be nice if when I clicked on one of these records in player details, I had a way to return to the previous screen. Okay, and ultimately what I want to do is I want to just trigger another segue back to the original. So the way I'm going to trigger that segue back to the original, so I have this players table view controller, that was my initial list. There's a method that I can add, and I typically will do it at the very bottom. There's an unwind segue method, and the idea here is this method is going to get triggered and it allows me to unwind back to this screen. And I can name it whatever I want, but I'm going to call it unwind to player list. Okay, and I don't even have to write any code in here for the time being, and I can leave it kind of as is. The way I'm going to trigger that method is if I go back over to my storyboard, I want to set up a bar button item here at the top for player details. So I'm going to go ahead and add a bar button item in my navigation. So here's this bar button item. And the bar button item that I want is, if I come back, system item, I want cancel. Okay, the way the cancel is going to work is when I hit this cancel, I want to transition to this exit. And you'll notice that it gives me this unwind to player list. So it's allowing me to trigger back to that initial player list. And that's where we put our unwind code. So that's going to trigger that segue. Okay, so now I have this segue, unwind to player. I'm typically going to put an identifier here so I can identify what it is. Because usually, like if we go kind of to the full-blown application, I might allow you to cancel out of this, which is great. You can see the player details, but you'll notice that I use text boxes in the player details. Ultimately, what I might want to do is when you select a player, I bring you over to the player details, you might want to be able to edit those player details. And when you edit those player details, what might happen is you might want to be able to save as well. So you might have another bar button item in the top right to either save or cancel. And then you're going to make the determination about what got clicked, either save or cancel, based on this segue identifier. Okay, so I'm going to call this cancel player details. That's the segue. For now, though, it doesn't really matter. We're not using that segue name. The idea here is that now I have a cancel, and that'll take me back to the main screen. Okay, so this is how we're going to hand off information from one screen to another. Is basically we're going to have an instance variable in the details table view controller, and that instance variable is going to get populated when the user selects one of the records. And then once it's selected, then we can populate kind of the outlets that are on the screen. We also covered how do we use table view controllers with static cells. So this is no longer populated based on a normal table where I have a collection of information and a collection of records and I'm populating each individual cell. Now I have a static table, which is basically saying, you know, here's the sections that I have and here's the data that I'm displaying. So what we have is a static table view. Okay, so at this point we kind of have that master details look and feel that an application might have. Okay, in the next video, I'm going to use this as a starting point, and what I want to do is I want to add on to this application so that we're able to remove records from this player list, and we're able to add new records to this player list. So there will be a little plus sign up here that'll allow us to add new records. And then I also want to add the functionality that if I click on Mike Trout and he wants to change his number, he can come over and change his number, and we'd have the option to save that, and that data then would propagate back to our player list. So for this video, all we're really doing is talking about master details and how do we establish that relationship between one screen and the next. Going forward, what I want to do is I want to add that add, edit, delete capability that you might see in a table view controller type application.